then the third section, which is the biggest, is giving you some examples about Israeli policies as they affect Palestinians today and for a long time. And I've divided that, as you can see, into... Can you see that all okay? Or like maybe you get another light off? I don't know. Because there'll be like some maps which will probably be easier to see if it's a bit dimmer. Unless it like plunges or something.
I think it's better.
Is it better? Okay. Plus you can like sleep easier and I won't see. So the section on policies will be about Palestinians who have got Israeli citizenship, and then also about Palestinians who are in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. And then the final section, Rethink to Reimagine, that's where I try and sort of wrap everything up with more of like a kind of overview or framework for looking at the situation as a whole. Okay, so hopefully to provide some useful or interesting thoughts about how to look at the situation in Palestine in general. So, first of all,
do you want us to save our questions to the end, or can we ask?
Yeah, it'd be good to save the questions to the end. And also, you just reminded me of something else, which is at the very end, I show my website address, and if anybody wants a copy of the presentation, feel free to just like use the contact form on my website to email and ask for it. So, Israel and apartheid, like, although it's not brand new to discuss Israel in terms of apartheid, that's been going on for decades actually in academic papers and books. But it's become more commonplace, let's say in the last sort of 10 years, 5 years. In the US, that became, like that was popularized to an extent by Jimmy Carter's book, which I'm sure a lot of people are aware of. But I think, but in general, like a lot of people are starting to like reach for that apartheid framework as a way of understanding Israeli policies. Now the first thing that I want to make clear, and this is often like an area of confusion when people think about Israeli apartheid, is that nobody is talking about a precise equivalence with what happened historically in South Africa. Okay, although the word apartheid obviously comes from the South African situation, meaning separation in Afrikaans, what's happened during that time and then since is that apartheid became rooted in international conventions, within international law, in a way that is now independent of, although obviously owing a lot to, what happened in South Africa. Okay? And this is a way of thinking about it in the words of John Dugard, who's a South African legal scholar and served for the UN in the occupied territories as a human rights monitor. He put it like this: it is Israel's own version of a system that has been universally condemned. Okay? So there is like an interesting comparison to make with the apartheid South African regime, but it's not whether how successful or accurate that comparison is not the grounds on which you test whether it's okay to talk about Israel in terms of apartheid. And without going into sort of the detail, here are some examples of where apartheid is embedded in these different international treaties, most recently within the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court as well in the 90s. And you'll also find that some think tanks and scholars have also started to analyze Israeli policies in terms of apartheid, which provide like long but interesting reads if you want to kind of take the time to do that. This is one example from the Human Sciences Research Council, which is a South African think tank. In 2009, they produced a very sort of detailed, comprehensive report on analyzing Israeli policies, asking the question, is it occupation, colonialism, or apartheid? And they were like, all three of them in different ways. John Dugard, actually, the South African legal professor who I just mentioned, he's just published a very long journal piece in something that I think is called the European Journal of Law, or something like that, looking at Israeli policies in terms of apartheid from a legal perspective. So all of that is to say that you're looking at, just to kind of clear up this mistake that a lot of people kind of think is being made, when you're not talking about a direct comparison with South Africa, but you're talking about this idea within international law that a particular scenario or a particular territory can have an apartheid regime at work, and you can sort of assess it based on these criteria. I just wanted to mention one other thing in the context of apartheid, and this report, I really recommend everybody who's interested, or if you think you're interested in Palestine, Israel at all, look up this report. The UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination reviews every country that is a signatory to the Convention Against Racial Discrimination, which amusingly Israel is, and they have to do a review of that country's policies like periodically. And in 2012, it was Israel's turn to have its periodic review by the committee. And when that happened, the language that the committee reported back in terms of Israeli policies was unprecedented in terms of its harshness. Okay? This is the State of Israel brings its evidence to the committee, NGOs bring their evidence to the committee, etc., and they produce these recommendations, these observations. This is the kind of language that the UN committee used about Israeli policies. They talked about, quote, segregation between Jewish and non-Jewish communities and a lack of equal access to land and property inside the pre-67 borders, right? Because some people will tell you that, okay, there's some messed up stuff inside the West Bank and Gaza, but inside the so-called Green Line, Israel is a flourishing democracy, blah, blah, blah. Well, this is talking about here about some policies which I will be expanding on that indicate institutional systematic racism inside the Green Line. And the UN Committee also said this, talking about the West Bank, a regime of, quote, de facto segregation in the West Bank severe enough to prompt a reminder of the prohibition of apartheid. Okay, that is the first time that that UN committee has used the term apartheid and cited apartheid within international law about any country since the time of South Africa. So that's enough about the A word, and I'm going to say something about the Jewish and democratic definition that the State of Israel gives itself. And I'm sure that if you sort of had even a passing interest in the conflict, you will have heard Israel being described as a Jewish and democratic state. You will hear Israeli politicians demanding that sort of Israel be recognized as a Jewish and democratic state, etc., etc. And I just want to provide a couple of different perspectives that are normally not present in the mainstream about how to understand the contradictions within that identity that Israel presents to itself. And the first sort of starting point for looking at that is the ethnic cleansing that took place around the State of Israel's establishment, what Palestinians refer to as Nakba, or catastrophe. Now, in that period, which was actually 47 into 49 mainly, around 90% of all the Palestinian people who would have been inside what then became Israel were expelled and prevented from returning home. Now, after the physical act of expulsion, Israel passed, or implemented these three laws, like over the next couple of years, that were really important for defining the boundaries of inclusion and exclusion. Okay, it's sort of like foundational laws for Israel's ethnocracy rather than a democracy. You've got the absentee property law, the law of return, and the citizenship law. And summarizing the impact of those three laws, what they did individually and together, what they said was that in the case of the absentee property law, all the property of the expelled Palestinian refugees is now being looked after by the state. Okay? The law of return says that any Jew living around the world can emigrate to Israel and become a citizen, working with the citizenship law, which, while working with the law of return to facilitate Jews moving to become citizens, also stripped the Palestinians who had been expelled of their right to citizenship inside the new state. Okay, so the three laws together were basically saying Palestinian refugees out, and Jews around the world come in, and the property of the Palestinian refugees is now in the ownership of the state and to be used by the new Jewish immigrants. Okay? So those three laws that were passed in the first couple of years of the state's existence really set the foundations for the sort of institutional discrimination that was going to follow. So if you were going to take if you're going to take only a couple of points away from the presentation to remember, this following one would be the one I urge you to take away, okay? Because it's something that is not present in most mainstream discussions about this issue. When Israel talks about having a Jewish majority that it wants to defend and protect, etc., the only reason why Israel has a Jewish majority at all is because of the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians in 48. Okay? The only reason why there's that Jewish majority there is because of the historical and indeed ongoing efforts to expel Palestinians and deny them Israeli citizenship. Now, Israel doesn't have a formal constitution, which is not unique, but what Israel has in terms of kind of like a quasi-constitutional structure are these basic laws. Okay, and they define like key aspects of the state, like the role of the Knesset and elections and the army, etc., etc. And I just wanted to highlight one basic law because it's useful for us in terms of how we think about the tension between Israel's identity as being both Jewish and a democratic state. That basic law is human dignity and liberty, which was passed in 1992. Now, you look at the name of the law, and you sort of read over the text quickly, and it looks like it's a basic law that's actually granting minorities rights. Okay? It looks like it's a law that's actually designed to protect the rights of minorities. But there's one section of that law, one clause, that is crucial for understanding the sort of get-out clause that exists for subverting the rights of Palestinians. And that is section 8. It says this: there shall be no violation of rights under this basic law, and this is my italics, except by a law befitting the values of the State of Israel, enacted for a proper purpose and to an extent no greater than is required. Right? So what are the values of the State of Israel? The values of the State of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. So what that has meant is, and this has been cited in different high court rulings, Israeli high court rulings, is that when there is a need to protect Israel as a Jewish state, that need is allowed to trump the rights of minorities who otherwise might be having their rights protected within that basic law, basically, if that makes sense. Here's another way of looking at it. These are the words of Ariel Sharon, obviously former Prime Minister. He said that Arabs, and again the italics are my emphasis, have rights in the land, but all rights over the land of Israel are Jewish rights. And it might seem like a simple language difference, but actually what he's communicating something quite profound there. Because what he's saying is that, okay, there are some Arabs here, which we're not so excited about, but they're here, and they have some rights, some conditional rights. But ultimately, fundamentally, according to this view, who has the rights to the land itself? It's the Jewish people. Okay, and that's a key difference. But you've got rights in the land and rights to it. Or about this from Ruth Gavison, who is a very prominent Israeli legal scholar. And she wrote an essay about a decade ago in which she was seeking to defend the right of Israel to exist as a Jewish state. But even though she was writing it as a defense of Israel as a Jewish state, she was at least honest about what that meant in practice. Okay? And she wrote this: "The Jewish state is thus an enterprise in which the Arabs are not equal partners." She's not talking about Arabs in Jordan or Lebanon or something. She's talking about Palestinians with Israeli citizenship, but saying that they are not equal partners within the enterprise of the Jewish state. And she went on to give specifics. "The needs of Jewish nationalism justify certain restrictions on the Arab population in Israel, particularly in areas such as security, land distribution, population dispersal, and education." Right, so sometimes Israel or Israel's defenders, they will say something like, okay, we understand that the Israeli Arabs might not be able to identify with the flag or with the anthem because it's Jewish, but ultimately it's not so bad. But actually, as Ruth Gavison is saying, and as I'm about to give examples of, Israel's identity as a Jewish state actually means, implicitly, directly, systematic discrimination, by its very identity. Okay? If the state's being set up as a Jewish state, it means that it's going to be discriminating against non-Jewish citizens. And that's what I'm going to focus on now. And I've divided this up into Palestinian citizens of Israel and Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza because it makes sense from the point of view of how Israel's regime works, right? Palestinian citizens of Israel are relatively privileged, right, compared to those in the West Bank and Gaza. For those who don't know, Palestinians are 20% of Israel's population. So it's basically the Palestinian community and their descendants that were not expelled in the Nakba in 1948. So you've got the historical context of the mass land confiscation that took place that didn't just happen in 48. It continued on through the 50s, into the 60s, into the 70s as well. Started to slow down after that. But here's to give you an idea of the impact early on. 48 to 53, first 5 years of the State of Israel's existence, almost every single new Jewish community that was built in that first 5-year period was built on the land of expelled Palestinian refugees. There's another way to look at it. By 1950, first 2 years of state's existence, cooperative settlements like the Moshavim, the Kibbutzim, right, the socialist, amazing liberal communities, held 45% of abandoned, which is euphemistic, or confiscated Palestinian land. By the mid-70s, so 30 years on, the average Palestinian community inside Israel, we're not talking about the West Bank yet, just inside Israel where they've got citizenship, the average community had lost 2/3 to 3/4 of its land. You can think about the impact that would have on a community in terms of its ability to naturally grow, economically thrive, etc., etc. There are also, within the Palestinian community inside Israel, 1 in 4 of them are so-called present absentees. Hands up who's heard of the term present absentee before? Not so sure, 1.5, okay? So, term present absentee sounds contradictory, right? Sounds a bit confusing. And that's because their scenario is a bit bizarre. So it means Palestinians who've got Israeli citizenship, but in 48, their families were expelled from their villages and their lands, but instead of ending up on the wrong side of the new border, right, instead of ending up in the West Bank or in Lebanon or whatever, they ended up inside what became Israel. So they received citizenship, but because they were Palestinian and not Jewish, they were still prevented from going back to the lands that they were from. Okay, so they still got impacted by the absentee property law and the legislation that was used to take the refugees' property. So they're like internally displaced persons, except that the war is over 6 decades ago and they're not allowed to come back and take their lands. Okay? And you're talking about, in many cases, a distance of a few minutes' drive, right, from their maybe still standing houses. That's a picture that I took in 2008. So every year when the State of Israel officially marks Independence Day, Palestinians mark Nakba Day, like remembering the catastrophe of '48, and the Palestinians here, citizens of Israel, are marching to the site of a destroyed village, which basically they've done for a while now every single year. And in this case, they're marching to Safuria, which was outside of Nazareth. Now, connected to, and part of, that land confiscation drive has been policies that the Israeli government has referred to as Judaization strategies. And what that means is that from the state's point of view, like from the Zionist state's point of view, areas of the country where there are too high a number of Palestinians in relation to Jewish citizens, that's a problem, right? That's a source of anxiety. And therefore you need to implement policies that will shift that demographic balance in those areas. Okay? And the two areas that have been often like the focus for those policies are the Galilee in the north and the Negev in the south, which are two areas which since '48 have continued to have like a relatively high proportion of Palestinians living in them. One example of the kind of strategies that were implemented in order to kind of implement Judaization was this, the creation of mitzpim, which means lookout communities. Okay, so the communities were referred to in a very militaristic way, and they were established on the hilltops in the Galilee. And as you can see from the language of one of the planners from the Jewish agency that was involved in creating these communities, the goal of them was to, quote, keep Arab villages from attaining territorial continuity. It's very similar motivation to the location and strategy behind a lot of the colonies in the West Bank too. And here's how it sort of relates to the discourse that is propagated by many Israeli politicians. This is the housing minister in 2009. He said it was a national duty to prevent the spread of Palestinian citizens. Talking about the Galilee specifically. Or Ehud Olmert, who was then the mayor of Jerusalem, speaking in 1998, a matter of concern when the non-Jewish population rises a lot faster than the Jewish population. And we should look at those two quotations and think about what would be the equivalent in like whatever community you live in. What would be the equivalent for an elected representative to say about how he thought it was problematic when one ethnic minority was growing, okay? Like, one would imagine that he would be sort of, or she would be branded as sort of racist, placed on kind of the far right of the spectrum. But in Israel, you're not talking about a fringe opinion, having that as an idea. You're talking about a core identity of the state and policies that were implemented by every single Israeli government since 1948. Another aspect of the ethnocracy inside the 48 area is the fact that you've got tens of thousands of Bedouin Palestinian citizens living in what are referred to as unrecognized villages. Now don't worry, I won't do this for every policy because it will get boring, but hands up who's heard of the term unrecognized villages? Right, a little bit more, okay? Now, I imagined it would be more because more people have started to hear about the plight of the unrecognized villages, although depressingly, that's probably because it's getting worse for them. So why are the unrecognized villages? Because going back to the 60s, when the Israeli state started to sort of give official status, mapping out the purpose of the different land within like the state's control, it would say, okay, this area is for industrial purposes, this area is for residential purposes, etc. And what they did was that they zoned areas where there were already Palestinian communities living as being non-residential. Okay, so there's already a village there, but it's suddenly written off the map from the state's point of view, because it's saying that it's an illegal location to have a community that was already there. And in fact, in some cases, like in an extra dark irony, they're only there because they were expelled from another place and put there by the military in the 50s. So these communities, because they're illegal, or because they don't officially exist, face big problems to be connected to water, electricity, gas, etc. They face home demolitions because, of course, like each individual house is also illegally built from the legal point of view. And most recently, and this is sort of happening right now, you have a thing called the Prava Plan, which is named after the guy who headed up the committee who came up with the recommendations. And what this is saying is that the Israeli government wants to develop the Negev for all of its citizens. That's the official branding of the Prava Plan. But what it means is that, we don't know the exact number, an estimated 30 to 40,000 Bedouin citizens are going to be expelled from their villages and their villages destroyed, and those communities pushed into government-recognized shanty towns, which all are at the lowest sort of socioeconomic indicators of Israel. The Israeli government will say, okay, but many of these communities are small, and therefore it's not economically feasible to connect them all up. The reason why you know that's a disingenuous excuse for what they're doing is that at the same time as doing that, they're connecting and establishing farms that are sometimes, large farms that are sometimes just run by one Jewish family. Or if you want to give a more recent example that just happened, the jet lag makes me forget what day it is, on Sunday, that's right, the Israeli cabinet met in the Negev in like a special session, and they approved the establishment of a new Jewish town directly on the location where there is a pre-existing Bedouin Palestinian town, okay? Which will mean, I mean, the implicit part of the plan means that that has to be destroyed. They didn't actually get mentioned within the cabinet's decision, so even in the decision they're invisible, but they will be expelled in order to create this new Jewish town. And Shimon Peres, who, for reasons that escape me, has like this nice image in the West, he said to US officials in 2005, stuff that came out in WikiLeaks, because he normally doesn't say this sort of thing in public, he said that Israel had, quote, lost land in the Negev to the Bedouin and would need to take steps to relieve the demographic threat. Right? That's the guy who's currently Israel's president, saying that non-Jewish citizens constitute a threat to the state based on their race. That's a picture from Al-Araqib, which is a village down in the Negev, which has become like famous because of the number of times that the Israeli state has demolished it and that the residents have returned to rebuild it. In about 3.5 years, it's about 50 times, more or less, that that's happened. The Israeli state demolishes it, the residents return, rebuild it, and it continues like that. And I think for me, like these pictures are from the more or less like one of the first few times in 2010. What kind of shocks me about that is these pictures look like they could have been taken somewhere like Rafah in Gaza or somewhere like that. And actually you're talking about pictures that have been taken from inside like good Israel. Very late appearance there from the guys at the back. Another example that I wanted to give that affects Palestinian citizens is, and this is not an issue that's well understood either, is the role of admission committees. And what that means is that in about 70% of Israeli towns, there is a committee that allows or denies someone the right to live there. Okay, so you submit your application to live in the community, and then this committee will like assess whether you can enter or not. And the criteria include social suitability. So you can imagine like how that gets used. And as Human Rights Watch talked about, they said that these committees have, quote, notoriously been used to exclude Arabs from living in rural Jewish communities. The role of those communities is now like been implemented by law in about 40% of cases. And when that law was passed a few years ago, when they were debating it in the Knesset, the members of Knesset were very clear about why they wanted that law to get passed. They said that the purpose of the law is to, quote, preserve the ability to realize the Zionist dream in practice. Right? It's a very exciting way to describe what is basically a planning law, but what they mean is that the Zionist dream in practice, for them, means the exclusion of Palestinians in order to establish a Jewish-only community. And finally, with regards to the Palestinians who've got Israeli citizenship, you've got the separation of husband and wife by law that's been around for about 10 years. And what that does is that it means that if you're an Israeli citizen, and of course in practice this only impacts really on Palestinians, if you're an Israeli citizen, it's illegal or highly difficult for you to live legally in the state with your husband or wife if that husband or wife is a Palestinian from the West Bank or Gaza. Okay? And that's who it applies to. Okay, so it's discrimination and separation of families. And that law's been around for 10 years. And when it was first implemented, the Israeli government gave the excuse of security, saying that Palestinians from the West Bank and Gaza were getting citizenship through marriage, and then going on to like commit acts of violence and terrorism, etc. Now, even if you were just to take it on that point of view, you could say, okay, well, why can't the security services assess everyone on an individual basis? But let's put that aside, because as the years went on, politicians, who every time they renewed this law, were more clear about the fact that the reason was demographic. And when it was appealed by NGOs and it got to the Israeli High Court, the majority opinion of the judges in the Israeli High Court defended the separation of families, and in their majority opinion they came up with this amazing phrase: human rights are not a prescription for national suicide. What they're saying there is that, yes, it's an abuse of human rights to separate husband and wife on this basis, but there's something more important, which is preserving Israel as a Jewish state. One of the members of Knesset of the Israeli parliament praised the High Court's ruling in these terms. He said that the High Court ruling was about the separation between the peoples and the need to maintain a Jewish majority and the Jewish character of the state. And just to give you a little brief comparison with what happened in South Africa, look at the language from the Apartheid South Africa political platform in the very sort of first years of formal apartheid. Either we must follow the course of equality, which must eventually mean national suicide for the white race, or we must take the course of separation. Okay? It's the same discourse. The same discourse of the need to preserve a majority, the need to separate the races, etc. So that, so far, has all been about the Palestinians who've got Israeli citizenship, and they are actually, like, relatively speaking, have got as good as it gets within the scheme of Israeli apartheid, right, if you can think of it that way. And now I'm just going to give you a look at what it's like for Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Remembering, of course, that they've been under military rule for almost half a century. Right? If you're a Palestinian in West Bank and Gaza under 50, you basically can only ever remember Israeli military rule. And there's not time to go into the detail of all these different policies, but just to give you a snapshot of what it's like in East Jerusalem, which Israel illegally annexed. Okay, so the Palestinians there don't have West Bank ID or Israeli citizenship, but Jerusalem residency for the most part. And life for Palestinians in East Jerusalem means home demolitions, a manipulative and discriminatory housing policy, discriminatory municipal services, and of course the apartheid wall that goes smack through the middle of many Palestinian neighborhoods in East Jerusalem, like separating what would have been the store across from your house, or the school across from your house, etc. The current mayor of Jerusalem, who was just re-elected in the municipal elections, Nir Barkat, this is a mayor who openly, publicly believes and states that Israel has to keep Jerusalem with a Jewish majority, and that he in fact even has like an ideal ratio for the ethnic groups within the capital that he intends to maintain. Okay, that's the elected mayor of the city that Israel says is its capital, openly saying in the media and to people who ask him, yeah, I have a desired ethnic ratio to maintain in this city. So again, imagine what would happen if the same thing happened in a capital city in the West, or a big capital city, or a big city, and the elected mayor was like, yeah, actually, I don't want this group of people to go above this particular percentage, and I'm going to make sure that doesn't happen. You expand the vision to include all of the West Bank, and you're looking at 500,000 Israeli citizens living in the illegal settlements that have been built since '67. And alongside them, and around them, you've got Palestinians who don't have Israeli citizenship, but under Israeli military law, whose freedom of movement is totally controlled for the benefit of the settlers. Okay? And their freedom of movement is restricted with like a twin track. On the one hand, you've got physical obstacles, like about 500 of them. And that could be a massive pile of stones in the road, it could be a checkpoint with soldiers, it could be a trench, it could be a gate, whatever it is. And there's 500 of them dotted all across the West Bank. Then with the physical obstacles, you have the bureaucracy, like the bureaucratic permit regime that means the Palestinian has to apply for a permit to go from A to B. You've also got, as I've already mentioned in the context of Jerusalem, the apartheid wall that Israel's built, most of which has been finished and most of which lies inside the occupied West Bank, shattering communities, taking away farmland, etc. And again, quite a long but important document to be familiar with if you're not already. The International Court of Justice, which sits in The Hague, was requested by the UN General Assembly to produce a legal advisory opinion about the wall. They published that in July 2004, and the ICJ judges, all of them with the exception of one, who was the American, to be honest, said that the wall was illegal in its entirety as far as it's inside the occupied territory, that it should be torn down, compensation paid, etc. Of course, none of that has actually been enforced. Another aspect of the apartheid regime in the West Bank relates to housing and permission. So 60% of the West Bank which is known as Area C because of how the Oslo Accords that were signed in the 90s sort of broke it all down. 60% of the West Bank, every Palestinian in that area has to apply for a permit from the Israeli military to build anything. Not just a house, but maybe like a shelter for your animals or livestock. And if you don't get the permission and you build anyway, then the soldiers can come, they see it, and they'll destroy it. Now, what that means is that because the Israelis set up this permit system, they say that the demolitions are just enforcing the law, right? The Palestinian didn't get the permit, they built anyway, so like any reasonable authority, they're simply enforcing the law. But as the UN found when they did a survey in 2008 of the previous 7 years, almost all of the applications are denied, right? 94% denial rate for Palestinians seeking to get that permit to build. So the Israeli authorities set up a system that is designed to fail for Palestinians seeking to get that permit. Give you one example from 2011. Over 600 Palestinian-owned structures destroyed in the West Bank in that year. And the EU observers produce a report every year. The EU, good at reports, bad at doing anything about them, said that Israel is carrying out, quote, forced transfer of the native population. Right? Forced transfer of the native population is how the EU observers described Israeli policies in the West Bank. And Human Rights Watch used this kind of language. Okay, I'm highlighting the bits of language that is important to think about here. Israel's regime in the West Bank is, quote, a two-tier system where Palestinians face systematic discrimination. Okay, a lot of echoes here with stuff historically speaking, both in this country and also in other countries. And then you've got the Gaza Strip, home to around 1.8 million Palestinians, okay, the majority of whom are a refugee population and are, in many cases, in refugee camps that are a few miles away from where their families were expelled in 1948. Okay? They might be able to see their farmland at the other side of the fence. Okay? Palestinians inside the Gaza Strip, fenced in, subject to blockade. Like a lot of people, for obvious reasons, associate the sort of most grim conditions of the Gaza Strip with more contemporary events. But actually, the restrictions on Palestinians in the Gaza Strip go way back to the early 90s. But of course have been harshened more recently, like particularly 2005, 6, 7 onwards. Now, it changes in the Gaza Strip, and of course, also from the Palestinian perspective in the Gaza Strip, the role of Egypt is important too. But if you want to see an example of how the Israeli security excuse is disingenuous in this case too, here's an example. Almost all exports from the Gaza Strip to the West Bank are banned by Israel. A blanket ban on exports from Palestinian businesses in the Gaza Strip to the West Bank, on the grounds of separation. But the official policy in the Israeli military documents, which some NGOs managed to get out, is a separation policy. Okay? There's not a security reason to stop an armchair made in Gaza City being sold in Ramallah. Okay? It's based on an economic punishment policy of the Gaza Strip, as well as part of the overall Israeli strategy to separate the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. And another example of what that means in practice is that a Palestinian from the Gaza Strip can't study, Israel prevents them from studying in West Bank universities. And of course, the Gaza Strip is also where Israeli apartheid is frequently at its most brutal and bloody, where Palestinians can be massacred and have war crimes visited upon them with impunity. And of course, like we're talking today, the day before the 1-year anniversary of another massacre that took place last year, so-called Operation Pillar of Defense. Okay, and I encourage you all to make people aware of the 1-year anniversary, okay, tomorrow and over the next 8 days on social media, etc., and pointing people towards the sort of real facts about what happened there, the large number of civilian casualties, the amount of destruction that was visited upon Gaza, which of course was actually nothing or relatively small compared to the huge assault that took place in 2008, 2009. Okay, I'm going to like crouch at this point, not because I'm doing anything weird, but because I want you to be able to see like all these slides without any sort of my head in the way. Okay? I know this is a bit witchy. Basically, this series of maps by the UN is going to show you all the different ways in which Israel has colonized the area since 1967. And this first one, which you can make it out, okay? Yeah? This first one has got purple dots everywhere, which are the built-up areas of the settlements. Okay, so it's just the built-up area of the Israeli settlements across the West Bank. Now the next one, which only adds like a little bit of red, so small you might not even have seen it, that's the land that is taken up by the unauthorized settlements, right? Settlements so illegal, even the Israeli government says they're illegal. The next bit of red that's taken up is land that is off limits to Palestinians because it's agricultural land reserved for the exclusive use of the settlers. The next bit of red that is taken up is off limits to Palestinians because the IDF, the Israeli military, reserves it as an area for them to train and conduct exercises in. The next area of red is restricted to Palestinians because it's been marked as like a nature area, like a nature zone. So like the occupation is environmentally friendly too. And this next area of red, which you might be able to guess, like from the way it, the way it kind of is the pattern. This is land that's now the other side of the apartheid wall. This one, the crisscrossing, it's the road network that also Israel controls. Now when you put all of those pieces together, that's what you've got in terms of the sort of little reservations and bantustans where Palestinians can exercise this very problematic kind of autonomy. And you can see that Israel has deliberately done it in a way that makes it impossible for any kind of genuine independent Palestinian entity of some description to emerge within that area. Just zoomed in, like 2 ones of Jerusalem, which is good because this is starting to hurt. This is from 1987, and this is around Jerusalem. You can see like right in the center, I'm actually going to get up at this point and point something to you. So this is the old city of Jerusalem here, and this dashed line is the Israeli expanded boundary of East Jerusalem. Okay, and the rest of it is the West Bank, and this side is like Israel proper. And these blobs here are the settlements that Israel had already built in 1987 around East Jerusalem. Look at the difference around Jerusalem from 1987 to 2005. Okay, big change in terms of both size of already existing settlements, but also like new ones were established. And you can see that the strategy, the Israeli strategy around East Jerusalem was deliberately done to cut off the city, to cut off Jerusalem from the rest of the West Bank. Okay, and that's why you see this sort of like semicircle of large colony blocks being built there. So this brings me to the last section of the presentation, which I've called Rethink to Reimagine. And this is where I want to try and provide some ideas as a way of trying to like interpret and group together some of these specific policies that I've been talking about as examples. The first thing I want to talk about is what I've described as making the links and the invisible green line. Okay, again, just in case there are people who are not sure what I'm talking about, the green line is the term that's used to describe the so-called border between territory that Israel controlled before 1967 and after 1967. Okay, everything the other side of the green line is the West Bank and Gaza Strip. The green line is invisible in 2 ways. Like what I'm proposing, it's invisible in 2 ways. Number one, the way that Israel has colonized the West Bank since 1967 has in most places rendered the green line an irrelevancy in terms of the way in which key, as you saw from the map, key chunks of the West Bank have been absorbed into the infrastructure of the state. Okay? You can work in Tel Aviv and live in a settlement in like the Ariel block, the Ariel finger, for example, if you're an Israeli citizen, and the green line in that sense doesn't exist for you. The green line is also invisible though in the second way, which for me is more important as a conceptual idea, in that Israeli policies towards Palestinians are the same in their goal and motivation on both sides of the so-called green line. It's the same priorities at work, whether you're looking at the Galilee, the Naqab, Haifa, South Hebron Hills, the Jordan Valley, Sheikh Zurah in Jerusalem, wherever you're looking within the de facto one-state regime that already exists, from the river to the sea, the Israeli policies towards Palestinians have the same goal in mind, which is to maintain a regime that privileges and grants sort of a position of dominance to one group at the expense of another group. How it's done legally differs according to the location and what sort of ID card the person has. But the basic goal, it's the same goal. Oren Yiftachel, who's an Israeli professor, he wrote an essay a few years ago where he talked about this. He said, the colonized West Bank, the besieged Gaza Strip, and Israel proper, each with its own official set of rules, are merging into one regime system ultimately controlled by the Jewish state. He's talking about the existence of a de facto on the ground one state, right? Because Israel controls all of the territory and the lives of the people living in it between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. Now, the only thing I would change in that, and like maybe he would too, because this is a few years ago now, is changing the verb of the tense merging into merged. Like I would say that has already happened. Like that is what exists now. And here's another way of thinking about it. 1 in 7 Palestinians are second-class citizens. 1 in 3 are under military rule. And half, or just over half, are not there at all because they're prevented from living anywhere there as the refugee population, expelled population. This is a sequence of maps that might be similar to something you've seen before. This is showing Jewish/state land ownership over a period of time. Okay, so the map on the left is Jewish land ownership in Palestine in 1917. Next one along is Jewish land ownership in 1947, so just a year before the state's established. Next one along, but like obviously a lot has been coloured in on the map, is 1960. So the state's been established and the state holds most of the land. And then right across on the far right-hand side is now. And you can also see ways in which large bits of the West Bank have also been like absorbed and eaten up. This next panel is more about it's about a practical reality, but it's also important like as a conceptual framework in my opinion too. This sequence of maps is about movement and access and privilege or denial. Basically where it's black, it's where you can go with a certain like ID card. Okay, so on the left-hand side, that's where you can go as an Israeli citizen. Next one along, that's your area as a Palestinian with West Bank ID. Next one along, that's your area as a Palestinian with Gaza Strip ID. And the end, nowhere, is where you can go if you're a Palestinian refugee. Take these two photos. You wouldn't know from looking at those pictures which one took place inside pre-67 Israel and which one took place inside the West Bank. Okay, because the same thing is happening in both places. Palestinians are having their property destroyed in order that next to them or in the future on top of them, Jewish communities can be created and thrive. And on the left-hand side, you're looking at some family in the Jordan Valley, and on the right-hand side, it's in the Negev. So I'm saying that there's a need to rethink so that our approach to the situation is based on the reality on the ground. Okay, so not like what it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago, or what some people tell you it really is, like mythically, but actually what it is based on the ground now. And an approach that's based on the failure of the peace process. Now, to describe the peace process as a failure is arguably a generous concession, because you can make a good case for the fact that the peace process, official peace process, was always about a process that would go on forever and never produce any real peace. Like at least not a peace with justice at its heart, right? But let's just assume that the peace process was meant to bring about peace. Well, 20 years later, under the Oslo framework, nothing. More Palestinian land taken up, Palestinians still killed with impunity, etc., etc. Also need to rethink in order to move beyond occupation discourse. And it's easier for me to explain what I don't mean to explain what I do. Move beyond occupation discourse doesn't mean that as people interested in raising awareness, educating and campaigning about Palestine, that we shouldn't have a focus on the cases where Israeli apartheid is at its most harsh, in Gaza, in the southern Hebron Hills communities, etc. But what it does mean is that we have to remember that those policies and those examples are one part of a bigger picture, or one component within a bigger system. Have to rethink, and like if this next point is not at least plausible, then like I should have stayed in London, rethink the orthodoxy about Israel's democratic credentials. Okay? Like Israel's presented as the only democracy in the Middle East, etc., etc., and I've provided a by no means comprehensive glimpse into the reality. And as we do all of that, what we will also have to do as we're rethinking is we will have to, and many of us already are, resisting attempts to ring fence off and to make taboo the question about whether Israel has a so-called right to exist as a Jewish state. And I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. A British politician, Nick Clegg, who's the Deputy Prime Minister, a couple of years ago, he described Israeli settlements as, quote, an act of vandalism. Quite strong language. I'm sure all of your elected representatives in Washington frequently describe Israeli settlements in such strong terms. But he said that, and there was no sort of like serious consequences for that, right? Like he wasn't reprimanded or disciplined or suffered some like problem. Because in the UK context, condemning settlements in quite strong language has now become just sort of par for the course, right? Like it's considered acceptable. But you won't find Nick Clegg going on the radio or on TV and saying something along the lines of, well, you know what? I think we need to like fundamentally question whether Israel has a so-called right to be a Jewish state because of what that means for the Palestinian people's inalienable rights. Right? That's still a question and a subject that is considered off limits. And of course, those who do discuss that and raise that as an issue typically face a lot of kind of attacks and smears, etc., which I'm sure like you've seen and sometimes I've seen too. After all that rethinking, then also we have reimagining, which is like a positive way to think about it. Reimagining to picture and to visualize a future that is based on genuine coexistence of equals. Okay? Unfortunately, coexistence for some people has got like a bad image, and that's because some people take coexistence, the concept of it, the word, and they abuse it and they misuse it in order to perpetuate the same colonial status quo. Okay? Because coexistence is not about sitting and having a talk over Argila and then going home and feeling better about yourself. Okay? Coexistence that is that simple is doing nothing to challenge the power inequality. Okay? It's doing nothing to dismantle the structures of apartheid. But coexistence per se, right, is like a laudable goal, but only if it's based on a relationship of equality. Also, reimagine so that we have an understanding of self-determination that's not about separation and division, but that's about two groups sharing the same space with equality. Reimagine so that the way we're sort of looking at the situation is emphasizing things like decolonization and democratization. And reimagine, most crucially, so that instead of can we return, or when will we return, Palestinian refugees can ask what kind of return do we want to create for ourselves. Just coming to a close now. Moshe Dayan, famous Israeli figure, his father Shmuel Dayan was in the first Knesset, the first Israeli parliament. And in 1950, the first Israeli Knesset, he said this: maybe not allowing the refugees back is not right and not moral, but if we become just and moral, I do not know where we will end up. Now, there is an answer to that, I think, in 2013. There isn't one of like walls and tanks and fear, but one of sort of hope and defiance instead. And I will finish with the words of the late great Edward Said, who said this: coexistence, sharing, and community must win out over exclusivism, intransigence, and rejectionism. And the only thing I would add to that for us sitting here today is that there's no time to lose. Thanks very much.
Well, first of all, thank you for the presentation. That was very eye-opening to some of the latest statistics and figures. In one slide, you showed the 1987 colonizing Jerusalem picture, and then again in 2005 in its expansion. That was that was 8 years ago, so almost a decade, almost 10 years. What are the current threats that Israel poses in Jerusalem as far as expansion? Is it at a higher rate, a lower rate than that gap that we saw?
Okay, so the jump from like 87 to 2005 in many ways created colony blocks that it's actually quite difficult to physically expand like much more. There is some of that happening. So for example, with Hahoma colony, built like between Jerusalem and Bethlehem, there are sections of that, there are plans that are sort of partway through the process of being implemented to physically expand the area that it occupies. But by and large, like that map is kind of similar. what I would say is happening more in East Jerusalem over the last few years is activities by Jewish settler groups working with the municipality, working with the Israeli government to move into Palestinian neighborhoods through dubious land purchasing, through manipulation of the legal system, ejecting Palestinian families, which we've seen like a lot of in a neighborhood like Sheikh Jarrah, but not just there too. And in Ras Al Amud it's also happened. So I think the big colony blocks, I mean, you can create more houses in them, but it's kind of difficult to physically expand a lot of them, with the exception of like Hahuma and also like Ma'aleh Adumim on the east, right? That can also be expanded to fill what is known as the E1 gap area. But like within Palestinian neighborhoods in Jerusalem, that's where you're seeing a lot of like Jewish settler activity, and that of course is sort of even more of a provocation in the sense that it's right in the heart of a Palestinian neighborhood, okay? And the settlers will have armed protection, etc., a lot of clashes between them and the local residents. So yeah, I'd say that's like a big problem in terms of Jerusalem. And of course, just as a final sort of addition to that, even more recently, you're starting to see a lot of efforts by far-right Jewish settler groups, unfortunately also like with allies in the Knesset, making efforts to change the status quo with regards to the Temple Mount, right, with Haram al-Sharif and Al-Aqsa, okay? And a lot of visits, let's say, by these settler groups to the compound and discussions that are taking place within the Knesset about whether it's possible to change the arrangements that currently, in theory, prevent like organized Jewish prayer in the compound.
I would just like to add on to a little part of that East Jerusalem issue that Palestinians are facing over the summer. I don't remember how many, but elementary, middle schools, and high schools were coerced to adopt Israeli curriculum, and that's also a big problem in communities facing East Jerusalem.
Did everyone hear that? Yeah. Yeah.
What's problematic about it? So Palestinians have always had their own Palestinian history and school curriculum, but now it's a curriculum of Apartheid. So it's just easier to change culture, it's indoctrination and brainwashing.
Any more hands up? Yep.
Can you explain present absentees again?
Yeah. So the present absentee, it's a Palestinian with Israeli citizenship who was expelled in 48, right, with the majority of the Palestinian refugees, but didn't end up like in a refugee camp in Lebanon or Jordan or something. Ended up like maybe in another village or another town inside what then became Israel. So all of the Palestinians who were left inside, most of them, and eventually got Israeli citizenship. So it was a Palestinian who received Israeli citizenship, but under like the racist legislation that was implemented, still lost their family land. Like even though it might be a 10-minute drive away, or like a 5-minute drive away, they still lost their land. So that's why, from one angle, they're like internally displaced. But that's not kind of the whole picture, because you normally think of internally displaced as occurring in the context of a conflict, right? And when the conflict ends, you go back. And in this situation, they're sometimes actual homes. Like I think of a family I know in Nazareth. The grandmother's house is a 5-minute drive away, but it's now part of a Jewish community, and it's not returned to them. Okay, so they are Palestinian refugees effectively, but also received citizenship too. Any more? Yep, here and there.
Ben, could you talk to us a little bit about your research methods and the kind of feedback that you've been getting about your work from different audiences, and you've been on a few campuses, right?
Yeah. Okay, so I mean, like, first of all, obviously I've had like the privilege, literally, to go to Palestine 9 times in the last decade. So that's obviously been huge in terms of visiting and understanding a lot of the different stories and aspects of the apartheid regime, and sort of being able to hear from people who directly are experiencing it and living it. A lot of reading. I mean, a lot of this stuff, it's easy to follow on a daily basis, right? From accessible websites, that it's not difficult for people to find. I mean, that's one of the advantages of the age we live in now, that we're not just reliant on like the New York Times or whatever. Like, what a nightmare. But we can find like stuff for ourselves online. And of course, there's a lot of scholarly work, academic work written by Palestinians going back decades, etc., that it's, again, like not too difficult to find if you have like the motivation to look. And like in terms of how my work's been received, yeah? Well, I mean, you know, swings and roundabouts, let's say. I mean, like tomorrow night, for example, if I took this tour as an example, because actually it's maybe quite a good microcosm, I'm doing 13 talks in 15 days. The vast majority of them, I'm sure, are basically going to go much like this one has been going, and like happened in USC and UC Irvine, where people have come because they're engaged, they want to learn, they've got interesting questions, etc. And there's very sort of little, like, at least open hostility. The exception to that whole sort of picture is going to be tomorrow night, where I'm speaking in Brooklyn College in New York, where there's been like a lot of craziness, like even before I get there in the media and stuff, but it's a very kind of context-specific case, okay? What I've found, particularly in the last few years, is that on campuses, okay, the ones that I've been to, pro-Israel groups don't, in my experience anyway, don't tend to come to make a problem in this kind of event, right? I think especially if the focus of the event is on like what's happening on the ground, it's like, well, what are they going to come and challenge, right? All they've got really when it comes to that is challenging, like trying to smear the person speaking or whatever it is. But yeah, so I mean, you know, the usual people will like cause some problems, but in general, I mean, look, all I personally try and do is gather the information that is available. That it, you know, it's not like a genius to find it, but just sort of present it in a way that hopefully is like accessible and points people in good directions, especially for them taking action too. There's one here.
Western states tend to generally be in line with each other in terms of foreign policy, and that you know, has extended to Israel. But the U.S. seems to have a far more hardline policy toward Israel on, like, you know, supporting it, while European states have been more, I guess, reforming on that attitude. Like, I guess one of the examples would be you know, most of them voted for the non-member statehood for Palestine. What would you say the reason for the difference in policy between the U.S. and Europe?
Okay, so actually, first of all, I would like to sort of undo a little bit of the assumption of the question, just in terms of the EU and European countries, and my country often gets like a free pass if people are just focusing on the very obvious example of the US. So the EU, for example, has a trade agreement with Israel, going back a number of years, which offers Israel a lot of benefits. Like the EU is the main destination for Israeli products. Yeah? As part of that trade deal, it requires the other party, in this case Israel, to obey basic human rights norms. Right? That's part of the agreement that both the EU and Israel signed, and on that basis you could rip it up tomorrow. Right? And that would have a big impact, right? That's not like a small thing from Israel's point of view. But the EU hasn't got anywhere near, like even suggesting that might happen as like a threat. You see right now what's happening with the proposed changes. Some of the changes that the EU's been talking about making that would restrict some of the grants that can be made by EU bodies and Israeli entities and institutions related to whether those institutions are part of the settlement enterprise in the West Bank. But what you've seen happen, right, is that the Israelis have gone to the EU and said, if you do this, like you said you want to do it, then it's bad for you too, because we won't be like investing in your universities and you're going to suffer. And what's happened is that they've basically been negotiating a way to make it as weak as possible, right? Like to still do it, but to do it in a way that has at least as small an impact as possible. So I'm just sort of emphasizing that bit because that's actually really important to understand about how Israel's like backing and cover, particularly like when you even broaden the picture to look at the role of the Palestinian Authority and the way that the EU is very important in sustaining a like unrepresentative sort of autonomous government that works very closely with Israel in terms of sort of maintaining the occupation. Yeah? So the EU's role is like horrendous. Okay? Now, having said that, there is of course like a difference with how it works in the US too. and that relates to like US like regional interests and US imperialism for the Middle East as a whole. It relates to the interests of the military-industrial complex too in the US that often has like close links to and economic relations to Israeli weapons manufacturers, etc. So there's like an economic dimension. And obviously also you have like organized pro-Israel groups that have money and resources and are organized, etc., and are able to have an impact on the political process. And it exists in Europe, but it's not as like in the same scale as that happens here. So there are differences, and you can maybe also start breaking it down into like cultural differences too, which is related to sort of how a lot of Americans sort of see the country as kind of like a pioneer settler state, like much as Israel can also conceive itself of, etc. But I guess my general point would be that there are differences, but actually I would like to, especially like as a British person and as a European, emphasize the role that is also happening. There would be a big difference if the EU implemented what it in theory says it believes in. Any more? Yes.
All right, so I don't know if you covered this before, but this may not be the focus of your research, but could you talk about the abuse of Palestinian labor and how Palestinians and non-Jews have been turned into like this virtual source of slave labor for Israel?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the like propaganda lines that Israel will say when it comes to boycott initiatives, and particularly of boycott of settlement products, is that by doing that you are harming the Palestinians themselves who have jobs there. I wrote something quite recently about the Jordan Valley and about the settlements in the Jordan Valley. And a lot of the settlements in the Jordan Valley are based on agriculture. And they employ, including Palestinian children in those agricultural settlements, on a tiny wage, in bad working conditions, etc. Now, before the Second Intifada, the amount of Palestinian labor inside Israel was much higher. Okay? And Israel's adapted because of the way in which the sort of separation has been harshened and sort of made a little bit more hermetic. But many Palestinians still get permit to go and work inside Israel, and again, doing construction jobs, working in service industries, etc. And many of them are not able to do it in a way which affords them sort of basic rights and insurance and all this kind of thing. Now that has also happened with not just like Palestinians, but Thai immigrants, African immigrants as well. But I think there's like a point I'd like to make about that, which is, although Israel has exploited Palestinian labor in different ways, like from the beginning, it's not like apartheid South Africa and some other forms of colonialism, where a key part of the model was the exploitation of the indigenous labor. Okay, from the Zionist point of view, and from the very beginning, and their slogans about Jewish labor, the idea is actually the removal of the indigenous population. And the way in which Palestinian labor has been exploited has been more of kind of like as a plan B, based on the fact that they weren't able to get rid of them all, right? So, you know, you sort of adapt to the circumstance, and that's what's happened. But there are some really good studies and reports done by NGOs, both inside 48 and also in, from West Bank and Gaza, which I can, like, if you bug me about it afterwards, I can send you, that are to do specifically with like Palestinian workers' rights issues.